Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Marvin Harada from the Buddhist Churches of America, and welcome to our Center for Buddhist Education event tonight, hosted by the subcommittee of the CBE, the Living the Dharma subcommittee. And our event tonight is titled Astro Dharma, Exploring the Intersection of Astronomy and Buddhism. You know, in college, one of my favorite classes that I took was just an elective. I took astronomy and it was the most fascinating class. So I'm really intrigued by this topic and looking forward to our lecture tonight. Let me briefly introduce our speaker, Reverend Peter Hata. Reverend Peter Hata was the guitarist for the Sansei jazz fusion group Hiroshima from their early years of countless community and bar gigs through their first three albums and tours of the US and Japan. Later, he left the group to study the more traditional jazz styles and eventually earned his master's degree in music from Cal State LA. Upon graduating, he was invited to become an adjunct faculty member and taught a wide variety of graduate and undergraduate music courses. His training as a minister began more recently in 2009 as a minister's assistant at West Covina Buddhist Temple, and then after receiving Kyoshi, which is the full ordination, he was appointed the temple's resident minister in 2012, West Covina Buddhist Temple. In 2014, Reverend Peter was transferred to Higashi Honganji's main Los Angeles temple, the LA Betsuin, where he helped establish the temple's lay education programs and study classes. In 2021, he retired from his full-time position, but is still active as a Shin Buddhist minister. Since retiring, he has lectured on Mahayana Buddhism, as well as music, jazz Buddhism, and the creative flow. And as an avid amateur astronomer, he has given astro dharma presentations, stargazing from a Buddhist perspective, at the Las Vegas Buddhist Sangha and at the Senshin Buddhist Temple. He's also a longtime fan of Star Wars and presented his seminar, The Way of the Jedi, examining the Buddhist themes of Star Wars in 2024 at the Higashi Honganji Buddhist Temple in LA. I think that's a great topic for a future CBE Living the Dharma gathering. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Peter Hata, a wonderful friend in the Dharma, and I've had him as a speaker at Orange County Buddhist Church many times over the years, and very fascinated by this topic of astronomy in Buddhism. Reverend Peter?
Well, thank you very much, Sensei. And good afternoon to all of you. And I want to thank you for attending today. I also want to, of course, thank Bishop Harada and the staff of the Center for Buddhist Education for giving me the opportunity to share some of my astro images and discoveries as an amateur astronomer. But as we are maybe more popularly known as a stargazer. Uh, and so, as Bishop Harada mentioned, this title, Astrodharma, Exploring the Intersection of Astronomy and Buddhism. This means that we're going to look at some examples of how various elements of astro or astronomy, which is the branch of science that deals with the physical universe, how these elements, I think, often resonate in striking ways with the Dharma, with the teachings of the Buddha. So you might say, oh, okay, fine. But what's specifically Buddhist about astronomy, or what's specifically Buddhist about stargazing? And so that's actually a very good question, because stargazing is not an activity associated specifically with Buddhists, like, say, of course, meditation would be, right? But interestingly, I recently discovered a kind of, I would say, endorsement. Maybe endorsement is a little too strong of a word, but an endorsement of Buddhist stargazing from arguably the highest authority in all things Buddhist, Shakyamuni Buddha himself. Now, this endorsement, if you will, appears in the collection of the poems of the elder monks known in the Pali Canon as the Therigatha. These are poems attributed to the early members of the Buddha's monastic Sangha. And I think one very interesting aspect of these Therigatha poems is how they praise the merits of experiencing the wilderness. And as the notes to these poems point out, the Therigatha contains the earliest descriptions extolling the beauties not of domesticated nature, but of nature where it's wild. These poems make a case for appreciating a kind of calm state of mind in the wilderness. But this is not an end in itself. It's that the wilderness provides an ideal place to refresh the mind in its quest for a higher happiness. So, I mean, that statement right there, I think some of you who, or all of you who enjoy experiencing nature and the outdoors, I think would certainly agree with that statement. But then there's a particular Therigatha poem that I think really stands out. And this is by a monk named Sona. And it's not only about appreciating the wilderness experience, it's actually about appreciating it at night. So apparently Sona was someone who was initially inspired by hearing the Buddha teach the Dharma, and who then decided to ordain and seek enlightenment. He had begun to meditate in the wilderness at night, just as the Buddha himself had done. However, he seems to have had difficulty staying awake. But fortunately, he received instruction and inspiration directly from the Buddha. This is Therigatha 2.37, Sona Potiriya Putta, translated from the Pali by Thanisaro Bhikkhu. It's not for sleeping, the night garlanded with zodiac stars. The night, for one who knows, is for staying awake. So after receiving the Buddha's instructions, Sona is said to have gone on to attain full enlightenment. And so, well, regarding these instructions by the Buddha himself, and I would add, as a stargazing Buddhist myself, one question is, what did the Buddha mean by the phrase, one who knows? Well, a little later, we will look a little more deeply into what this knowing might be. Let me stop my share. But, for now, I think we can agree that 2,500 years ago, the Buddha was someone who knows. And I think we should begin by considering, okay, what did the Buddha know? And I think this will help us see the resonance between the Dharma and the astro images that we'll be looking at. So very briefly, in one of the earliest biographies of the Buddha, it's said that upon his completing the third and final stage of his deep meditation under the Bodhi tree, and, interestingly, while gazing at the morning star, the Buddha realized the truth of the impermanence and interdependence of all things. And then throughout his life, he taught that not only is everything impermanent and constantly changing, in this constant flow, nothing arises all by itself. Everything arises dependent on myriad other things. And so, of course, today, we can witness this Dharma, this ultimate truth and reality, and appreciate its evidence in our own lives. So I think if you've ever experienced a Buddhist funeral or a Buddhist memorial service, or on the other hand, let's say, welcomed a new child or grandchild to your family, then I think you know about impermanence and interdependence. But we can also witness the Dharma in the night sky. But so before I begin, I'd like to ask you, all of you, if you can name one object other than the moon and planets, which are too easy because they're, very visible in the sky, but any object in the night sky that you remember really impressing you when you saw it in the night sky? No, not a helicopter or a plane or or a satellite or something like that, but a night sky object, like for instance, the Big Dipper, the constellation of Orion, or maybe the Milky Way. Can you put it in the chat if you remember some night sky object that really impressed you? I'd just like to see. Oh, the Southern Cross. Okay, Big Dipper, the Milky Way, rings of Saturn. Okay, planet, but that's cool. The Big Dipper, Orion. Yes, Orion, shooting star. Okay, very good. Venus, Orion's belt. Very good. Perseid shower, star, shooting star. Okay, thank you, Gary. Oh, and wonderful, a clear view of the Milky Way and the east in the eastern Oregon night sky. Very good, Mintaka. Yes. Oh, some of you are really kind of you know your stars. The Pleiades, very good. Okay, yes. We'll talk more about the Pleiades later. Uh, and that's fine if you saw the International Space Station. That's fine. That's up there. So, oh, the Aurora Borealis. Okay, very good. Okay, I'm going to move on, but yeah, those are great answers, and that gives me a lot of encouragement because I really enjoy talking to all of you, but I really enjoy that some of you are already kind of have some uh, positive impressions from the night sky. So that's really great. So thank you. So let me share with you uh, an image that I took of the Orion. Here, let me share my screen here. So this is an image that was taken by my telescope of the Great Nebula in Orion. So those of you that mentioned the Orion's belt, if you know that you look at the three stars of the Orion's belt, and then you sort of go slightly down from the leftmost star of Orion's belt. I think if you at least have a binoculars or if you have a telescope, you can see this sort of fuzzy. You can see a fuzzy gray image of something, and it's actually the Orion Nebula. But so this is not an image that you'd be able to see with your naked eye or even through the eyepiece of a telescope. Through an eyepiece of a telescope, what you generally see is a sort of, as I mentioned, a kind of indistinct grayish cloud. But this more detailed and colorful image is possible because my telescope has a very sensitive camera that can employ what's called it's called live stacking. And so what it is the camera takes an image and then saves it and then takes another image and stacks it in real time upon the previous image. And so over a period of say 5 minutes to 10 minutes, it's gathering a lot more light than our eyes can see, of course. So live stacking is the technology that was used to create this. Also, the telescope and camera are on what's called an equatorial mount. So this is a mount that can continuously track the Orion Nebula as it moves throughout the night sky. So it's tracking the Orion Nebula as it moves from east to west across the night sky. And of course, this movement of objects across the sky is just one of many examples of impermanence. Due to the rotation of the Earth, the night sky is in constant motion. And so the Orion Nebula is called a deep sky object, or DSO, because these objects are far beyond our solar system. So our sun, you might know, is 8 light minutes away from us. But the Orion Nebula is some 2,000 light years away. So, one way to kind of conceptualize this distance is that the photons of light that are captured in this image actually left 2,000 years ago, maybe only a few hundred years after the Buddha lived. That's how far away it is. And so what is a nebula? Well, a nebula is a dense cloud of cosmic gas and dust. And in a nebula, or the plural of nebula is nebulae, in nebulae, gas and dust are visible because they're interacting with, or to use a Buddhist term, they are interdependent with the intense radiation or light energy of nearby stars. So the bright core that you see right here actually represents what's called a stellar nursery. The dust and gases that exist throughout the universe are condensing under the force of gravity and forming new stars. And then in turn, these new stars are extremely bright and energetic, and their energy is ionizing the dust and gas, causing it to emit red light or reddish light, which you can see in the nebula here, which indicates hydrogen gas, and blue light or bluish light, which indicates oxygen gas. And since its colorful display is caused by the radiation of nearby stars, the Orion Nebula is known as an emission nebula. So let me share with you some other examples of emission nebulae. All of these are visible because of their interaction or interdependence of the light energy from stars with the dust and gas that exists throughout the cosmos. So this is the Eagle Nebula, and actually it's famous. I don't know if you can kind of see that it sort of resembles the shape of an eagle, but it's really famous because of those small finger-like structures in the center. I don't know if you can see them, but right there, it looks like a finger. Can you see that? Um, they are known as the pillars of creation. So, after the seminar, if you want to Google that, you can see pictures of the pillars of creation that NASA has taken that are much bigger than this image. But of course, NASA has the Hubble telescope and the James Webb telescope, which are out in space, so they don't have to deal with the problems of light pollution that I'm going to talk about earlier. But even in this image, you can see the pillars of creation there right in the center of this nebula. Another emission nebula is this one. This is the Lagoon Nebula, and it's one of the largest nebulae. It's about 5,000 light years away. This one I just wanted to kind of include it because it was very difficult to image this nebula for me from my backyard because it's in the constellation Sagittarius, which from Southern California, the constellation Sagittarius goes very low across the southern sky. And so guess what I see when I look south from my backyard? I see a very bright street light. So this was very difficult to get this image because of basically because of light pollution. Now, here's an image of a nebula known as the Cygnus Wall. It's a very famous nebula and one of the most popular nebulae to image. It does have kind of a three-dimensional wall shape, and that's why it's called the wall, or the Cygnus Wall. It's called the Cygnus Wall because it's found within the constellation Cygnus. And another thing about this that makes it kind of interesting is, can you see what resembles a little bit of the shape of the continent of North America? Can you see that? So it's also part of the North America Nebula. No, I'm sorry, the North America, it's called the North American Nebula also. If you look at not the wall part of it, not this wall part, but the whole shape of it resembles the continent of North America. And now, besides these emission nebulae, another type of nebula, which is kind of like I guess you could say a reverse example of interdependence, is a so-called dark nebula. This is the Horsehead Nebula. And a dark nebula is a nebula whose gas and dust is so dense that rather than radiating light, it actually blocks the light of anything behind it. And this is one of the most famous dark nebulae. It's called the Horsehead Nebula. This is the Horsehead Nebula. Of course, can you see that it looks a little bit like the head of a horse? And this is the Flame Nebula, which is an emission nebula. Um, And actually, this is called the Horsehead Nebula. But when I look at it, it sometimes seems a little bit more like not like a normal horse, but more like maybe a is that called a star horse, or the kind of horse that you find in tanks, in freshwater tanks. But it's a very famous nebula because it's a dark nebula. So this gas and dust here is so dense that it's blocking the light of the Mission Nebula behind it. Now, another type of nebula is the planetary nebula. So in stargazing guides, or guides to the night sky, the planetary nebula are among the most often listed, and it's because of their very strange shapes. So I think you can see why this nebula is called the dumbbell nebula. It kind of has the shape of a dumbbell here. But actually, I think from a Buddhist perspective, these planetary nebulae are highly illustrative of impermanence, because planetary nebulae are the remnants of a star that has died and whose dust and gas has expanded outward in a kind of shell. So apparently, sometime in the distant future, our own sun will experience a similar fate, at which time the dust and gases of the sun will return to the interstellar medium, and then out of which new suns will be born. So I think that the dynamic and interdependent processes taking place in these nebulae are a really stunning illustration of the same truths that Shakyamuni awakened to. So 2,500 years ago, the Buddha, is basically verifying what astrophysicists today are, you know, discovering, which is that they're discovering the same truths that the Buddha awoke to. Everything in the universe is both impermanent and interdependent. In fact, maybe this isn't so surprising, but according to many astrophysicists, the entire universe is actually one interdependent system. The dust and gases of the interstellar medium that exists throughout the entire universe have formed and are forming all matter. Okay, let's look at another interesting type of deep sky object, or DSO. This is an object known as a star cluster. So star clusters, there's various kinds of star clusters, but one of the most common type are the so-called globular cluster. And what's interesting about these objects is that their origin is unclear. They are huge collections of stars, just like a galaxy, but then strangely, they are organized, spherically instead of as a flat disk. So here's one of the most famous globular clusters. This is the Hercules cluster, so named because it is found in the constellation Hercules. As I mentioned, it's a globular cluster because of its spherical rather than disk-like shape. It's really one of the most stunning objects, and actually, because it's relatively bright, it's observable even with a small telescope. I don't think you could see it naked eye, but you could see it with a small telescope and maybe even with binoculars. Interestingly, not only do astrophysicists not yet know why they have a spherical rather than a disk-like shape, it's also not known why globular clusters are typically found only around the outskirts of galaxies. I think it's believed that there's some kind of relationship between their globular shape and their position in the outer regions of a galaxy's spiral arms. Okay, so now speaking of galaxies, galaxies are arguably the most well-known deep sky objects. Galaxies are huge collections of stars around a center that's believed to be a black hole, which is where the matter is so dense and gravity so strong that even light cannot escape, which is, of course, very hard to get your head around. I was wondering, did any of you see the mind-boggling sci-fi movie Interstellar? Have any of you seen that movie? I have some friends at the temple that, I wasn't really I'm not that interested in that kind of sci-fi per se, but they kind of talked me into watching it, and I found that it was like a 3.5 hour movie. So, but anyway, it really was really fascinating because I guess the main character of that, one of the main characters of that movie is a dark hole. So if you're interested in dark holes, you should watch Interstellar. But let me show you an image here of some galaxies that I took here. This is a image of what's known as Markarian's chain. And so as you can see, it's kind of a chain of galaxies here going this way. And the reason I was interested in this image is because this image helps give us an idea of the incredible vastness of the universe. So these galaxies are about 60 million light years away. Um, Unlike the Orion Nebula that I was talking about earlier, which is 2,000 light years away, these galaxies are 60 million light years away. And so the light from these galaxies began their journey to my telescope right around the time, give or take a few million years, when that mega asteroid crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula and wiped out the dinosaurs. So, talk about impermanence. But actually, these galaxies are about really probably one of the most distant deep sky objects that my particular telescope can image. I just wanted to see what my particular imaging rig could do, and I was surprised, that it could capture images of objects that are so far away. But at the same time, I think you could understand that when you talk about time in on the order of 60 million years, um, it can be rather, I think it's rather humbling actually, because it makes our own lifetime seem, infinitely brief. And just sort of interesting fun fact is that even though these galaxies are 60 million years ago, currently, and this is just with my, amateur astronomy setup, but you might know that the James Webb Telescope right now is, because it's so powerful and it's way out in the darkness of space, is able to image galaxies that are near the beginning of the Big Bang. So it's actually imaging galaxies from around close to 13 billion light years away. 13 billion light years away, near the beginning of our universe. This is only 60 million light years away. Um, okay, I'd like to now show you a series of images that I've taken of probably the most famous galaxy. Over the course of a year, as I was just starting out as an amateur astronomer, and then as I sort of progressed into uh, eventually into astrophotography, or a form of astrophotography. Um, this first image here is an image of the Andromeda galaxy. This is what you'd see through a telescope. This is actually what's taken through the eyepiece of my telescope. So it's, uh, finding the galaxy, which is pretty difficult from my backyard. You can't see it naked eye, and you really can't even see it with binoculars. You need at least a small telescope to see it. And then I held my iPhone up to the eyepiece, and I was able to capture this image. This is what you would see through most normal visual telescopes of Andromeda. You're mostly seeing the bright core of the galaxy here, but you can also kind of begin to see a little bit of the rings here, the spiral arms of the galaxy, but not very well. And now this second image is an image that I took when I added my very sensitive astro camera. And so, as I mentioned with the Orion Nebula, this is a technique that's known as, it's called live stacking. So um, it's used with a type of observing known as EAA, or electronically assisted astronomy. So as you can see here, there's much more detail of the uh, galaxy structure that's becomes visible. Um, so not surprisingly, EAA, or electronically assisted astronomy, is becoming more and more popular amongst amateur stargazers, especially amateur stargazers that live in any kind of urban environment or even suburban environment where you really can't see the galaxy without the use of some kind of uh, electronic assistance. And now let me show you the third image. So this is the third image of Andromeda, and this was taken using the exact same equipment, but not using the live stacking technique of EAA. This is an example of what's known as astrophotography. So instead of live stacking maybe a half hour or so of 1 or 2 minute images in real time, in astrophotography, hours of images are taken. So that the telescope is pointed at Andromeda. It takes maybe a 1 minute image, saves it, and then takes another 1 minute image and saves it, and another one for, I think this particular image was 5 hours, 5 hours of 1 minute images that are then stored in the computer and then processed later on my desktop computer with, excuse me, with software. And so the advantage of astrophotography over EAA or live stacking is that obviously you can get a lot more light can be captured by the telescope, and then quite a bit more detail becomes apparent. And this fourth image here, again, same object. This image represents basically where I am at in my progress as an amateur astronomer. So this image shows the same galaxy and basically about the same number of hours of imaging, but also represents the use of much more advanced astrophotography software, much more advanced and much more expensive software, but with a steep learning curve. But this software is able to correct the color in the rings of Andromeda that you saw earlier with the sort of more brown color. And it's able to show some, areas of the blue oxygen gas, and then much more detail in the rings, distinguishing between the, dark, they're called the lanes of the rings, are the circles of the galaxy. And, it's showing a lot more of what Andromeda really looks like in terms of the more advanced astrophotos that you might see. Let's see. Okay. I showed these 4 images of the same object. These are all taken from my backyard because I think this series of images of the same object illustrates some important things. One is how difficult it is to capture an image of Andromeda, even as large and as relatively bright as it is. And the main reason for this difficulty, as I alluded to before, is another example of an impermanence, and maybe more specifically, our human tendency to kind of wreck our environment. And I'm talking about light pollution. So light pollution from street lamps, from signs, from buildings and so forth, is literally obliterating the darkness of night. And then galaxies, which don't have the concentrated brilliance of stars, excuse me, are particularly susceptible to becoming virtually invisible to us on Earth, which is, very sad. But also, I think the Andromeda galaxy warrants a little extra attention because it's the closest galaxy to our own Milky Way galaxy. And so, of course, close in galactic terms means it's only 2.5 million light years away. So its light actually left 2.5 million years ago. And I did some quick research about what this means anthropologically. I think this would have been around the time that the earliest pre-modern humans began walking on 2 feet in Africa 2.5 million years ago. And also, Andromeda is a massive collection of about 1 trillion stars. So it's has about twice the number of stars as our own Milky Way galaxy. So it's huge. And then, like everything else in the universe, Andromeda is also moving, and it's another example of impermanence. But I've made sort of a sort of stargazing joke out of this because its movement, shall we say, is a little closer to home because Andromeda is on a course to collide with our own galaxy. Uh, but that's maybe 5 billion years in the future, so we can kind of relax. But meanwhile, Andromeda's in Andromeda's spiral arms, these dust and gases are interacting and constantly forming new stars. And so, as I've seen other astrophysicists comment on, we too are all formed from the same dust and gases, the same carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and so forth. Millions of years ago, every atom in our bodies was probably out there somewhere. So I think that observing and thoughtfully reflecting upon the deep sky objects of the night sky, can help instill in us a deep appreciation of the Dharma, of Shakyamuni's insight into impermanence and the interdependence of all things. And this is because the night sky and all of its objects are simply manifestations of the Dharma itself. So that, when we're stargazing, we're actually really observing the Dharma, this ultimate reality of the impermanence and interdependence of all things that the Buddha awoke to. And then when we comprehend or, try to comprehend that there may be as many as 2 trillion galaxies in the universe, I think we can begin to realize just how incredibly rare our existence is, and therefore, how precious our life and all other life is. But now, before I conclude, I wanted to discuss one other deep sky object. And unlike the Hercules globular cluster that we looked at earlier, this is an open cluster. And probably it's the most famous open cluster in the night sky. As a star cluster, it's visible naked eye. And so there are seemingly endless number of stories and myths about this star cluster throughout human history. This is the star cluster known as the Pleiades. But first, does anyone recognize this logo? You can type it in the chat. I think actually somebody already mentioned it. This is the logo of Subaru, or in Japanese, Subaru, the Japanese, which is the Japanese name for the Pleiades star cluster, and also known as the Seven Sisters. You can see that, one of the sort of anomalies of the Subaru logo is it only has 6 stars when, many other stories and myths like Greek myths refer to it as the Seven Sisters, but that could be because one of the 7 stars is rather dim. So, we won't hold that against the company Subaru. But the Pleiades is a deep sky object that many consider the most beautiful star cluster. So here's my image of it. And so, like the various emission nebulae we viewed earlier, the stars of the Pleiades are also illuminating dust and gases and creating the same kind of, nebulosity that we saw in the Orion Nebula. But unlike the Orion Nebula, the Pleiades is not an emission nebula. It's a star cluster and not a nebula at all. But its nebulosity has the characteristics of what is called a reflection nebula. But I think that to me personally, what makes the Pleiades unique, even among reflection nebulae, are that these stars, though, through what we might call their myriad causes and conditions. I know, you're saying, wait a minute, stars don't have causes and conditions, but okay, just bear with me here. Through what we might call their myriad causes and conditions, somehow found themselves running into clouds of oxygen-rich gas, and hence were able to create this beautiful glow. So at least to me, the beautiful glow of the Pleiades, caused by its stars just having to fortunately run into clouds of oxygen gas, is like a metaphor for the way our own lives can likewise only glow if our fortunate causes and conditions allow us to receive the support of our family, our friends, and our teachers. I think you can see why the Pleiades is one of my favorite dark sky objects. But now, interestingly, the Pleiades were also known to our very early human predecessors. These were the early modern humans who created paintings in the famous Lascaux cave of southern France about 20,000 years ago. So I'd like to share with you some fascinating material in Jo Marchant's book, The Human Cosmos, Civilization and the Stars. In these passages, she discusses the early discovery of what appears to be a painting of the Pleiades in the Lascaux cave. As Jo Marchant says, in this cave, there's a curious pattern of dots that recurs in art around the planet and throughout history. The number varies, but commonly it's a close-knit group of 6 circular spots distinctively arranged in lines of 4 and 2. This motif is seen in far-flung communities, but in all cases, the dots represent one of the most characteristic features of the night sky, the star cluster Pleiades. This clutch of 6 or 7 stars appears in multiple myths and legends. They are also a distinctive part of the constellation Taurus. The Pleiades sit just above the shoulder of this celestial bull, with its thrusting horns, prominent eye, which is the giant star Aldebaran, and another star cluster, the Hyades, splashed in a V across its face. So let me share with you an actual image, night sky image of the constellation Taurus with the Pleiades above. So here you can see the face of the bull. This is the face of Taurus, and this is his eye. This is the star Aldebaran. And then this is, of course, the Pleiades here. And, you know, the unmistakable blue glow of the Pleiades that I think attracted people throughout time to its beauty. Now, try to remember this orientation if you can, because we're going to reference it again in a little bit. But, you know, as Jo Marchant continues here, the frequent appearance of this 6-spot pattern demonstrates the importance of the Pleiades in societies around the world, as well as the shared human desire to capture aspects of the starry sky in art. But there's more to this story, another example of these dots that seems, frankly, impossible. The Cave of Lascaux in southwestern France is famous for its wealth of Paleolithic art, paintings and engravings of animals thought to be 20,000 years old and dating from the dawn of humanity. Scholars have argued over their meaning for decades. Meanwhile, barely noticed on the ceiling of its grand entrance hall are 6 plain spots that match the Pleiades perfectly. Neatly painted in red ochre, they float above the shoulder of a majestic bull. I think if you look closely here, you can just make out some dots on the ceiling in the upper right corner of this photo, right about here. I don't know if you can see these dots here. This is, of course, the bull, and this is what appears to be the Pleiades. Jo Marchant then continues her discussion of the Lascaux cave and discusses the bull to the right of the photo there. She says, the largest and perhaps most recognizable painting in the entire cave is known as Bull number 18. It has a striking similarity to the modern constellation Taurus. It even has V-shaped spots on its cheek. And what if this painting in the Lascaux cave is actually a star map? One invented by the supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers of Lascaux. In recent years, experts in fields such as anthropology, mythology, and astronomy have begun to argue for a radical reassessment of our Paleolithic ancestors. Could the artists of Lascaux really have painted constellations? And if so, why did they care so much about the sky? This question takes us to the heart of what the universe meant to the very first humans who had the ability to imagine, remember, explain, and represent. The cosmos they created still shapes our lives today, end quote. And, you know, when I read this passage, I found this really striking because I think Jo Marchant is absolutely correct. The cosmos still shapes our lives today because, as we've seen in the various astro images, it's a manifestation of the truths of impermanence and interdependence, just as we ourselves are. And now, next, she discusses more about the particular significance of the Lascaux cave. So, quote, this cave now ranks as one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries in history. This cave is one of various caves decorated between 37,000 and 11,000 years ago by anatomically modern humans who first migrated into Europe from Africa around 45,000 years ago during the last ice age. It's a period called the Upper Paleolithic, named for the stone tools in use at the time, and it seems to have hosted an explosion in human creativity. The creations of these early humans provide a rare and hauntingly beautiful insight into the prehistoric human mind. Who were these early people? What did they care about? And what triggered them to create art? What was it, in effect, that made them human? End quote. And then Marchant goes on to discuss what is, I think, the most astounding discovery about this cave. One of the major discoveries came when researchers realized the cave, with its overhanging walls and paintings that crossed the ceiling, might not represent animals as they're seen on Earth, but animals as they appear in the sky. That could explain why the animals often appear to be floating, painted at all animals without any ground lines, sometimes even with hanging hooves. And actually, there are some scholars that went even farther. These paintings weren't just animals imagined in the sky. The artists of Lascaux were painting maps of the stars, end quote. So in this close-up of the famous bull, bull number 18, can you now see the Pleiades right here? And it turns out, and this is the Taurus, the bull, with the sort of V-shaped stars on its face. As it turns out, the positions of the bull and the dots above him very closely matches the constellation of Taurus and the Pleiades that we saw in that earlier night sky photo of the constellation Taurus. So, do you remember that earlier quote of the Buddha that I shared with you? I think that now, given our discussion of the Lascaux cave, we might have a more complete understanding of what the Buddha meant by the phrase, one who knows. So you might recall that the Buddha had said that the night garlanded with zodiac stars is not for sleeping. Instead, he said, the night for one who knows is for staying awake. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think we could, certainly interpret this quote of the Buddha as a kind of validation of stargazing, as the encouragement of the Buddha to go outside under the garlanded zodiac stars and mindfully appreciate the manifestation of the Dharma, both in the night sky and, of course, within ourselves. However, I think the Lascaux cave paintings themselves are also a validation, if you will, of what we might call mindful stargazing. These cave paintings, inspired as they are from the early humans' observation of the night sky, seem to remind us of our essential humanity, of who we really are, and that even 20,000 years ago, our ancestors were sentient beings capable of appreciating and being in touch with the Dharma as it manifested itself in the night sky. No, they did not call it, the Dharma, but I think that in carefully and artistically creating scenes in the cave that reminded them of the night sky, there's the evidence of a humble, appreciative attitude, one that seems to me to be quite spiritual. In fact, to me, it's as if they created a kind of temple to give expression to their appreciation. And then, even though they lived many thousands of years before the Buddha, this appreciative attitude seems very much in line with the Buddha's encouragement to stay awake, be mindfully observant, and become one who knows. And so, in this sense, it's not so important what it is that one knows. So, for example, the various ideas and concepts used in Buddhism, it seems to be more important how one knows, and that they have this humble, appreciative attitude. So actually, I think this is a deeper significance of the term astrodharma. This is stargazing through the lens of the Dharma. And of course, while it's certainly an enjoyable and refreshing activity, it's also one that could be transformative. It's an activity which, if we have this appreciative, humble attitude of those early humans of the Lascaux cave, this is an attitude that has the potential to allow us to become one who knows. Okay, in conclusion, so I hope that I've stimulated your interest in stargazing in astrodharma, but I need to clarify that, of course, stargazing, even mindful stargazing, is not necessary to attain awakening. In Buddhism, there are many, many paths and many practices that can lead to one becoming, one who knows. But I do think that stargazing can be a wonderful complement to anyone's progress along the path. And also, I'm only a beginning astronomer, but I do hope that you've enjoyed my images of the fascinating variety of deep sky objects, and that I hope that you found it instructive to see these objects of the night sky through the lens of the Buddhist teachings of impermanence and interdependence. But maybe most importantly, I hope they help in one way or another to develop in us the same kind of appreciative attitude that we saw in those early humans of the Lascaux cave. And so finally, as the Buddha said, and here I'm slightly paraphrasing, the night, for those who know, like our ancient human predecessors, is for being awake. Thank you very much for listening. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.